The Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, according to Matthew. Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and curing every disease and every sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them, because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, ask the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." Then Jesus summoned his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out, and to cure every disease and every sickness. These are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, also known as Peter, and his brother Andrew, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James, son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, Simon the Cananean, and Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed him. These 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions: "Go nowhere among the Gentiles, and enter no town of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. As you go, proclaim the good news. The kingdom of heaven has come near. Cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons. You received without payment, give without repayment. Take no gold or silver or copper in your belts, no bag for your journey, or 2 tunics, or sandals, or a staff, for laborers deserve their food. Whatever town or village you enter, find out who in it is worthy, and stay there until you leave. As you enter the house, greet it. If the house is worthy, let your peace come upon it. But if it is not worthy, let your peace return to you. If anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, shake off the dust from your feet as you leave that house or town. Truly I tell you, it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that town. See, I am sending you out like sheep into the midst of wolves, so be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Beware of them, for they will hand you over to councils and flog you in their synagogues, and you will be dragged before governors and kings because of me, as a testimony to them and the Gentiles. When they hand you over, do not worry about how you are to speak or what you are to say, for what you are to say will be given to you at that time. For it is not you who speak, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child, and children were raised against parents and have them put to death. And you will be hated by all because of my name. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. When they persecute you in one town, flee to the next. For truly I tell you, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes." The Gospel of the Lord. Please be seated. So, I love the movies. Their ability to inspire us, to make us laugh, to make us cry. When we see a movie strictly for entertainment, we get our money's worth. But when we watch them through the eyes of faith, movies can open our minds and our hearts to God in ways more powerful than we might imagine. As a result, the ordinary commercial film becomes what we call the Jesus movement. It becomes a story for Jesus. And one of my favorite movies is The Green Mile, written by Stephen King. Set in the South during the 1930s, we meet John Coffey, an enormous man, a giant, that has been accused of murdering 2 girls. And upon his arrest, he is delivered to the Green Mile, which is the name of death row in a southern prison. Now, it quickly becomes clear that John is innocent. He is sweet, and what we used to call simple-minded. Despite his enormous size, he weeps quietly at times and is often afraid of the dark. He shows tenderness to all, but the truly evil ones he encounters on the Green Mile. And after a couple of miraculous healings performed by this gentle giant, there is no doubt that John Coffey is our Jesus figure in this story. In one scene, we witness a gruesome execution by electrocution. A sadistic corrections officer named Percy deliberately omits a step in the electrocution process, essentially cooking and torturing an inmate named Edward Delacour, a man for whom John Coffey and everyone else has grown really fond of. During the painful execution, Dell screams, jerks, and cries out and jolts. Meanwhile, John Coffey in his own death row cell is experiencing exactly the same torture. He jerks and he grimaces as though he were sitting in the electric chair himself. After the execution is over, the police officer in charge of death row, Paul Edgecombe, returns to his block and walks to John's cell. There, John is sitting, and he says, through clenched teeth, covered in sweat, "Boss, Dell, he's the lucky one. He's out of it now." "Do you mean you heard this all the way down here, John?" Edgecombe asks. "No, boss. I felt it." John Coffey actually felt the pain of his friend Dell. He experienced his torture as though he somehow had been in the body of Edward Delacour. But what can John Coffey show us about the nature of God if we view him through the lens of Christ? I'm going to come back to this in a minute. But first, let's look at the gospel. In Matthew's gospel today, we learn that Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease, sickness. And Matthew continues, "When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd." Compassion. Compassion. Feeling another's pain, another's suffering. Compassion literally means shared suffering. It is grounded in love, and it requires the compassionate to act, because feeling in itself is an action. And there are a lot of feelings in our world today. Uncertainty, anger, fear, frustration. These are some of the many feelings, and much of them are rightfully centered around the injustices of racism. For many, the chronic nature of racism creates a sense of helplessness and uncertainty that encourages a withdrawal from others. Still, for some, there are growing feelings of resentment, feelings that cry selfishly for retribution. Retribution as a way of justice. And retribution is the selfish path of justice. Or rather, it's a short-sighted path. Retribution is the cry of an eye for an eye. And while it does give us the false sense of justice has been served, retribution itself does very little to establishing lasting justice. And it ultimately drowns out our ability for compassion. We may not be able to be like John Coffey and bodily feel the suffering of another, but we can be open to walking with them in their anguish by trying to identify how we would feel in their anguish. How would we feel if we thought we could not trust anyone? How would we feel if we thought we cannot be trusted by anyone? Yet, having compassion doesn't give us permission to accept others' feelings of anger or resentment, and then in our attempts to connect with them, excuse their violent or abusive acts towards others. Because the other side of the same coin in Jesus' command in the Sermon on the Mount is to turn the other cheek. Turn the other cheek. This guides all of us to refrain from responding to injury with revenge, which creates more injury. By asking us to turn the other cheek, Jesus is inviting all of us to focus on forgiveness and loving others with compassion. This is, without a doubt, the most difficult thing Jesus asks all of us. But if we only focus on concept of justice that says an eye for an eye, we risk creating a system of justice that only focuses on retribution and leaves no room for the greater atonement and reconciliation that creates lasting justice. Retribution grounded in violence only creates more violence, creating a vicious cycle that can and will only be broken with an uncompromising mission to live and teach compassionately. Yeah, it's hard work. It is extremely hard work. But if we are serious in our desire to listen and learn from and follow Jesus, if we love him enough to go to some trouble for him, then we should express our willingness to be compassionate. We do it by reestablishing relationships that are authentic and respectful. If we're serious about learning, living, and teaching the gospel to promote compassion, then we need to realize that we are the disciples that Christ calls to be the laborers sent out into the harvest. Jesus calls us out to live the gospel as evangelists, and we are called to seek and live compassionately. Now, being raised an Episcopalian, I'm all too aware and I recognize that for some reason, evangelism is hard for most of us to do. Perhaps the image of the corrupt TV evangelist so offends our sensibilities that we want to do nothing with evangelism. It may be that we find it difficult to speak with anyone about serious, intimate concerns and their lives or our own. Maybe we think talking about faith is bad manners. Whatever we use to avoid talking about or doing the work of evangelism, we must never lose sight of the fact that Jesus prayed for it to happen. Jesus' prayer for us to do evangelism is actually a prayer and a command for us to be compassionate. The pain, brokenness, and despair of people in the world around us has to be an immense importance to us, and we are called to evangelize compassion. Jesus sends us out to do the work that springs from a heart filled with compassion, with empathy, with doing our best to experience another's pain. We could never reach this ideal, of course, because each person's pain is unique. But the heart of the compassionate Christ, which is and must be our own collective heart, has no place for criticism, has no place for judgment, and it certainly has no place even for justified anger that calls only for retribution. We help those who need help, not those we deem worthy of our help, only because they think like us, or act like us, or speak like us. Nor do we reserve compassion only for those who agree with us. It is not our own help we offer. We are merely the vehicles and the voice for Christ's healing, his touch, his saving grace, his hope. Now, what can the movie The Green Mile show us about the nature of God, if we view it through the lens of Christ? Well, first off, the movie is not entirely about John Coffey. By the end, we learn that the story is being told by the death row supervisor, Paul Edgecombe. Paul is a caring, ordinary man who takes excellent care of the men on the Green Mile he walked. He avoided conflict and keeping the peace whenever possible. But after he discovers John's amazing abilities to heal, a profound change begins to happen in Paul. He begins to feel that there's something more he should be doing. He seeks to reconcile John Coffey's innocence with the world. He tries to teach others to have compassion for John, and he tries to have coffee freed from his execution. Now he ultimately fails, but not before John, our Jesus figure, at the time of his execution, forgives Paul and blesses him for his growing compassion. He forgives and he blesses Paul. Paul repays this by continuing to evangelize for John long after the execution is over. So you see, the story is not only about John's compassion. The additional lesson is that we should try and be like ordinary Paul. What needs doing in the world requires ordinary people like us. God's work requires the very experiences we've had at work, at school, at play, raising a family, or doing whatever is normal. For everyone's gifts, skills, and experiences are needed to carry out the task of evangelizing or proclaiming and carrying out the imperatives of the gospel. The imperatives of the gospel that say, loving our neighbor as ourselves, providing for those in need, turning the other cheek, seeking justice and peace, and never, ever giving up on our own ability for compassion and our desire for reconciliation in our world. Together, and only together with God, do we walk the mile. Amen.